Chapter 5 Know Your Enemy. What do creatures from outer space look like? In fact, we have no idea if they exist at all. But UFO believers have developed an elaborate lineup of supposed visitors to this Earth, including greys, reptilians, and many subcategories, each with its own traits. What would happen if, after a series of devastating wars and natural disasters, every school, every TV station, every newspaper, and every large website warned that these dangerous beings were among us, that they were responsible for many of our misfortunes, and we had to be on constant alert to guard against them? How quickly would people who looked a bit like the images of aliens be attacked? How quickly would prejudice against fantasy creatures turn into real violence? When you think of the Middle Ages, you probably pictured knights and ladies, tall castles, and tales of heroic quests. That period actually began around the time of the Crusades. From the middle of the 11th century on, Europe began to grow in population and in wealth. As new towns were built, each added an impressive cathedral. The statues and stained glass windows in these beautiful stone buildings provided a way for the scholarly churchmen to share their ideas with the illiterate peasants. The church was not just a place of worship, it was the center of all communication. There, ignorant men and women who would never travel more than a few miles from their homes learned about heaven and hell, about history, and about the world. The stories told by the churchmen deepened the villagers' fears, hatreds, and suspicions. The monks knew from their books that there were other people in the world, outside of Europe, but unlike the Greeks, they no longer met with Asians or Africans. They had to rely on the descriptions in ancient texts. Trained to trust Aristotle's word as long as it did not conflict with the Christian teaching, the monks believed the ancient Greek when he said that climate defined character. Then they added their own thought. How a person looked must be a reflection of the state of his soul. You could read a person from his appearance. Ugly people had ugly secrets. Curly-haired people were fearful and arrogant. Small ears were a sign of evil. Dark-skinned people from southern lands must be timid and cruel, though also especially observant. The monks' study of the ancient texts led them to produce one particular damaging set of images, portraits of what they called monstrous men. These were the barbarian, semi-human descendants of Cain. According to the Bible, Cain murdered Abel, his brother, and was condemned for it by God. Due to their sins, his descendants had deformed bodies and sick minds, and survived only on the edges of earth, from extreme southern Africa to the far north. The monstrous men include dog-headed men who spoke in barks, tiny men so small they could ride on birds, one-eyed creatures whose single foot was so large it could be used as an umbrella, men with no necks whose heads were in the middle of their chests, strange men whose only nutrition was the smell of apples. All of these beings lived without clothes in savage places far from cities. Many were said to be cannibals. Here were the savages from Uruk, mixed with the barbarians from Aristotle, and judged in Christian moral terms. The reports by travelers such as Marco Polo, who left Europe, some of them the records of real journeys, others completely invented, confirmed that the monstrous men existed and could be found by anyone who dared to look for them. Augustine believed these creatures were basically human and could be saved, but others were not so sure. The invention of monstrous men was a crucial crossing point on the way to the idea of race. They were a product of the beliefs in Augustine's world in which only religion mattered. No one would have thought of conducting a scientific test to see if there were any dog-headed men or if they had actually taken on that form due to some family sin. All questions were really questions about the state of a person's soul, and all answers were to be found in the Bible and other approved ancient texts. Yet these invented characteristics were also applied to real peoples, which added one more layer to the dark brood that would much later take form as race. With the monstrous men, physical characteristics had become crucial. One pillar of what would become race was in place. Men condemned by their sins to inhabit distorted bodies were not the only monstrous people. There was also more recognizable types. Dark-skinned Ethiopians, Jews wearing odd funnel-shaped hats, ferocious Muslims. Churchmen held the same debates over Ethiopians, Jews, and Muslims as they did over other monstrous beings. Were they human and capable of salvation, or were they bestial allies of the Antichrist? Ethiopians were any dark-skinned Africans, not people from the area of modern Ethiopia. Blackness was associated with sin in the medieval mind, and dark skin suggested that these were particularly demonic people. Some scholars think that this negative view lingered long after the Middle Ages and is one reason why Europeans were later so willing to hold Africans as slaves. Yet these churchmen were basing their ideas on ancient texts and religious theories, and that led to other ideas about dark-skinned people from far-off lands. There were medieval scholars who argued that God created Ethiopians as a symbol for everything marvelous and wild, and there was also a tradition that Ethiopians were particularly noble. Starting in the 1100s, paintings showed that Balthasar, one of the three wise men who came to witness the birth of Jesus, was black. In the medieval world, it was quite possible to invent fables that put Africans in a very positive light. For example, in the 1100s, stories began to circulate about a dark-skinned Christian king named Prester John, who was ready to join in the crusades against the Muslims. Apparently, he wrote a letter to a Christian ruler telling about his fabulous kingdom. His magical land was filled with not only monstrous men, but also dragons, griffins, and a phoenix. At first, Prester John and his Christian army were thought to be in Asia, but by the 1400s he began to appear on maps of Africa. Perhaps some of the racial prejudice of later slave-trading Europeans has deep origin in medieval ideas about blackness. As we will see, those European captains and sailors were living in an entirely different world. Medieval ideas about Ethiopians are important not just because they may have made their way into modern prejudice, but precisely because they are based on such different view of the world. Rome built a slave society around rank, not skin color. Similarly, medieval questions about which moral lesson God was teaching by creating Ethiopians point out how much race is a creation of our own time. Ethiopians could be monstrous men or fabled kings. Either way, they were imaginary beings few Europeans ever met. Jews were a completely different case. Jews had spread all across the Roman Empire, remained in their scattered communities throughout Europe. It did not require a daring traveler to find Jews. In fact, between 700 and 1,000, Jews were doing well in Europe. They kept up the trickle of trade that still connected Europe to the rest of the world. Some became prosperous landowners who were wealthy enough to employ Christian workers and even own Christian slaves. Others were artisans running small shops. The Bible forbids charging interest on money, so Christians eager to keep their souls pure and their accounts balanced forced Jews into being their bankers. Jews gained money and influence from this role, but it was a precarious one. Any king who did not want to pay a debt could simply stir up resentment against these Jews. The very fact that there were Jews living in Christian Europe presented another problem. Jews made Christians uncomfortable because they were the only non-Christians in their world. Jews were a constant goad for they had chosen to reject Jesus. When Jews from stories in the Old Testament were depicted in artwork, they were often shown as wise and thoughtful, important ancestors of Jesus. But like the Greeks, Christians were furious that Jews were sticking to their own beliefs. Peter the Venerable, a leading church figure from the 1100s, positively sputtered with anger. How long, wretched ones, will you not believe the truth? How long before your iron hearts will soften? Behold, how for a long time now, nearly all the world has recognized Christ, and you alone do not recognize him. All the nations obey him, you alone do not listen. All tongues affirm him, you alone deny him. Peter's sense of nearly all the world and all the nations shows the special problem of the Jews. The fact that somewhere on the ends of the earth there might be people who did not worship Jesus was not even worth mentioning. The Jews were nearby in Christian lands, the real world. Contemporary Jews were shown in art and sculpture as hard-hearted, as marked off from other men, as deformed by their rejection of Jesus. For example, even though Jews did not wear funnel-shaped hats, they were always shown doing so. This was a kind of sign, a way to easily identify the Jew. So too was his large nose, a trait he had in common with demons. A bearded man with a large nose wearing a funnel-shaped hat was a Jew. But there was also more to him than met the eye. A mistranslation from Hebrew into Latin led churchmen to believe that Moses had horns on his head. The most learned scholars who could read the Bible and knew how important Moses was interpreted the horns as a sign of his power and glory. But when illiterate peasants saw a horned Moses in a church, they could draw their own conclusions. And they did. Many believed Jews were devils. Jews were commonly supposed to have not only horns but tails, which they hid beneath their cloaks. Then there was a matter of blood. Jews had seen Jesus suffer and had not helped him. Superstitious Christians believed that Jews, or perhaps their leaders, were cursed with wounds that they could never heal. Only by drinking Christian blood, or baking the blood of a specially chosen Christian boy into their ritual bread, could they temporarily stop the loss of blood. Imagining Jews as witches or vampires is a nightmare fantasy that reveals the mentality of a Christian Europe. Jews were permanent strangers living amid fearful neighbors who knew little about the world beyond their village. During their first crusade, Europe showed the effect of all of these fears and images. Some of the peasants who took up the cause believed that you did not even have to reach the Holy Land to be absolved of sin. All you had to do was kill even a single Jew. In France, Jewish communities were able to buy off the gathering armies, but as Peter the Hermit led his men through Germany, they would not be appeased by bribes. A Jewish chronicler reported that in Mainz, a port city on the Rhine, the Crusaders with their insignia came with their standards before our houses. When they saw one of us, they ran after him and pierced him with a spear to the point that we were afraid even to cross our thresholds. And the Holy Warriors decided to fight their first battles with the monsters close at hand, the Jews. In images of monstrous men, prejudice dating back to Aristotle and beyond merged with Christian teaching and the superstitions of peasants. These warped fantasies linked together the peasant and the scholar. At least in hating and despising Jews, Ethiopians, dog-headed cannibals, and Muslims, Europeans began to have a common way of seeing the world. The descendants of the many people who shattered the Roman Empire were united in not being monsters. You can see in this the beginning of a sense of race. Physically different groups living in different parts of the world and worshipping different gods were so different they might not all be human. One way of picturing this phase in the growth of ideas of race is to think of how people who look odd or unappealing are sometimes viewed today. No one would say they are of a different species, but too often they experience prejudice and discrimination. That is the kind of pre-racism that was directed against outsiders before there was any theory of race. Ironically, one of the main reasons for the new growth and prosperity in Europe is that the Crusades brought Christians into contact with Muslims. The Muslims have salvaged knowledge dating back to the Greeks about which the West knew nothing. Not only that, but the Muslims enjoyed a far better grasp of numbers, of mathematics, and of practical mechanics. As soldiers returned from battle, they brought with them ideas, books, mechanical drawings that helped Europe to develop. Yet as Europe emerged from the centuries of ignorance and barbarism, the very improvements created new fears and fostered new prejudices. A stronger Europe became preoccupied with the secret enemies within its own borders.